Hello, and welcome to a presentation on examining online scam prevalence and victimization in Singapore. I'm Afreen, and with me I have my colleague Ms. Vivian Seah. We are psychologists from Ministry of Home Affairs Singapore's Home Team Behavioral Sciences Center, specifically the Crime Investigation and Forensic Psychology branch. A brief caveat. Firstly, the views expressed in this presentation are our own and do not represent Home Team Behavioral Sciences Center or the Ministry of Home Affairs Singapore. I would like to take this chance to acknowledge our advisors and our research team. For the scope of our presentation, we'll have four main themes. Firstly, the online scam landscape, the study results from SGBSC's National Prevalence Survey of Scams, followed by the solutioning and some recommendations, and finally, a brief summary. So I'll be sharing on the online scam landscape first, looking at the trends seen around the world and in Singapore. So in the past, we've seen a range of cybercrime and mass marketing schemes to be the most common. We've seen lower amounts lost and also fewer cases and incidents of scams. However, in present day, there's greater sophistication, higher scam incident rates, and also amounts lost. In the future, we suppose that there'll be even more sophistication, more layered social engineering techniques using emerging technologies and global contexts. We've also seen a worrying trend in Singapore. So there has recently been an increase in the number of scam cases reported, as well as an increase in the amounts cheated. We've also seen that there has been an evolution in the modus operandi of scam perpetrators and expanding variants, as can be seen from some of the news headlines on the slide. So now I'll be passing over my time to Vivian to talk about some of the study results. Vivian, over to you.
Thanks, Afreen. So due to the concerning scam landscape internationally and in Singapore, we saw a need to conduct a national prevalence study of scams to better understand the scam situation in Singapore. The survey was developed by in-depth review and benchmarking of over 200 journals and reports, as well as consultations with stakeholders. Due to the COVID-19 restrictions previously, phase 1 of the survey was administered online to 4,043 Singaporeans and PRs, permanent residents, in year 2020. We then conducted field surveys in phase 2 to reach out to the groups that we couldn't adequately reach via the online survey. So phase 2 was conducted between late last year to early this year to elderly migrant workers and migrant domestic workers. To comprehensively study scams prevalence and factors associated with scams, we have a total of 85 variables in our survey across 4 different sections. Now I'll first go through the 6 key findings obtained from both phases 1 and 2 of the study, which will cover the scam prevalence, the profiles, and scam experiences. So firstly, on the prevalence, we found that scams are pervasive, with 6 in 10 Singapore citizens and permanent residents who indicated encountering a scam approach in the past 1 year between August 2019 to September 2020. Among the 63% of the sample approached by scammers, 11% were near miss and 45% known as evaders who managed to evade the scammers. 7 out of 100 in Singapore fell prey to scams. Out of the overall respondents, 3% were repeat victims and 4% fell prey to any type of scams once. In comparison with global scam prevalence rate, we see that scams are prevalent not just in Singapore, but internationally as well, just like what Afreen has mentioned earlier. However, interestingly, in phase 2 of the study, we found a reverse trend for non-hits and hits, whereby 62% of elderly indicated that they had never encountered scams in the past 1 year, between end 2020 to early 2022. Among those who encountered scams, most managed to evade scams, with only 1% who fell prey. A similar trend was observed for the migrant workers and migrant domestic workers groups, with a majority who did not encounter scams in the past year. Those who did manage to evade the scam and only 1% fell prey. So I'll move on to share about the demographic variables we found for victims and non-victims of scams. In phase 1, we found that majority of victims were young adults, which was a surprising finding for us and reminded us that anyone could fall prey to scams, even those who could be more tech-savvy. Importantly, 45% of those who fell prey did more than once. This shows that scam victims could remain vulnerable to scams despite falling prey before. On the contrary, interesting as well that we found elderly were among the majority who indicated that they had never encountered scams, which led us to conduct phase 2 of the survey to understand the scam trends among the elderly group. And we found this finding to be aligned to phase 2 results that I've mentioned earlier. Majority of the elderly did not encounter scams in the past year. Next, I will share the scam experiences that victims faced in both phases of the study. Our study found Singapore citizens and permanent residents encounter scams most frequently online, especially through internet websites and online ads, while elderly and migrant workers did most frequently via phone calls. The difference could mirror the online usage patterns of the different groups, with the general population serving the net more compared to elderly and migrant workers. This highlights the wide variety of modus operandi by scam perpetrators through online means, phone calls, SMS, etc. We found that most victims fell for e-commerce scams. The findings from phase 1 is aligned to local scam statistics, with e-commerce being the top scam type in 2020. The amounts cheated among Singapore citizens and PRs were also concerning, with an average of 37,000 Sing dollars, with those who fell prey more than once losing significantly more. In phase 2, although we found e-commerce to be the top scam type, we have to caveat that this according to the small number of scam victims mentioned earlier due to the low victimization rate reported. So moving on, besides financial losses, the emotional consequences of scams may be as serious. Although many see scams as a financial crime, scam victims may experience significant emotional distress following the crime. So as we can see here, these are all the quotes from victims from phase 1 of the study, which shows that victims may experience impacts of scams such as anger, feelings of stress, helplessness, shame, guilt, fear, and loss of confidence. Some were also struggling with depression, suicidal. The emotional trauma should definitely not be neglected. Following their experience, victims may face symptoms of post-traumatic stress. So for phase 2 of the study, the elderly population also expressed sadness about falling victim to scams, while migrant workers indicated anger, frustration, loss of trust, increased caution, to mention a few. However, despite the huge impact that scams could cause, with the need of social support for scam victims, only half of the general scam victims sought help or support from their family or peers, while a higher proportion of victims seek information and financial support. Many of the victims were embarrassed about their experiences and would prefer not to share their experiences and trauma with others. This was a similar trend for elderly and migrant workers groups, whereby most did not seek support from family or friends. So I will now pass the time on to Afreen, who will share more about the other key findings of the survey.
Thank you, Vivian. So looking now more into some of the cyber hygiene practices, the literacy, and the perceptions of safe online practices, we found that, in fact, victims tended to display poorer online hygiene, and a greater proportion of them compared to other subgroups actually engaged in risky online behavior, such as clicking on pop-up advertisements, opening emails from unknown sources, and also clicking on links without checking the origin verification. In addition, we saw that victims tended to display poorer knowledge of safe cyber practices and endorsed, in fact, unsafe practices that made them probably most susceptible to scams. So, for example, we found that 49% of victims wrongly believed that authorities such as governments or banks would send them SMSs or emails to click on links to verify their personal information, compared to 28% of the overall respondent group. However, in contrast, the subgroups, including elderly and migrant workers, endorsed safer cyber practices. In fact, we found that only 22% of elderly respondents and between 12 to 15% of migrant worker groups endorsed the false statement. Also, we saw that only 6% of respondents are from the elderly group, and between 2 and 6% of migrant worker groups endorsed the statement that it was a common practice to share their one-time passwords or their general passwords with others. However, we did see that the elderly seemed to be a lot more unsure about safe versus unsafe cyber practices. Moving on to some of the psychological factors and the individual traits and attitudes influencing susceptibility to scams, we found that risky psychological attitudes may actually increase susceptibility to scams. So we explored the attitudes of respondents using validated psychometric scales and saw that victims, especially repeat victims, tended to display stronger traits of impulsivity, fear of losing out, and compliance, as indicated by the red circles on the slide. The victims also tended to be a lot more self-conscious, more easily influenced by others, and complacent, believing that they were less likely to fall victim to scams. The elderly, however, were also seen to be more likely to conform to culture-specific attitudes, such as endorsing the idea that it is a good thing to be kiasu or have the fear of losing out. In contrast, when we look at non-victims, we saw that the evaders especially displayed a high level of vigilance, strong knowledge of scam tactics, and also had the better or right attitudes of scam vulnerability, meaning that they were aware that they were not immune to scams. So we can see that protective psychological traits may in fact decrease vulnerability to scams. The elderly, we found, were also more likely to provide and do things in a way that actually protected them. So we found that the elderly were more likely to double check what other people told them, and they were a lot more concerned about sharing personal information. On a similar line, migrant workers and migrant domestic workers are also more likely than the general Singapore population to be concerned about the possibility of being scammed. Now, looking into some of the solutioning and recommendations for scam prevention and intervention, perhaps it's useful to think about how solutioning can focus on public education, law enforcement, and community efforts as a whole. We're providing concrete scam prevention tips, having a greater need for officer training and post-victimization support, as well as highlighting the shared community culture and promoting guardianship. There may be a better efficacy of scam prevention initiatives out there. For the general population, this can be through the emphasis on vigilance, promoting scam literacy, and cultivating the idea of informal guardianship so that everyone can safeguard and support one another before, during, and after scams. Lastly, for more tailored approaches, groups can be targeted in different ways, depending on their use and the modalities. So for the elderly, something that may be useful would be to capitalize on social support and also improve their cyber literacy and financial literacy skills. Migrant workers may be useful to increase vigilance, enhance peer support, and also tap on different social media campaigns. So overall, here's a final look at the key takeaways and anti-scam recommendations. So overall, we've seen a worrying and rising trend of online scams. From our survey, we found that there is technically a high encounter rate for the general group, while subgroups have a low encounter rate. But across both, we've seen a low victimization rate. While risky attitudes may make someone more vulnerable to scams, protective traits may make them a lot more protected. Solutioning, therefore, can be based on a combination of law enforcement, public education, community efforts, and tailored according to different subgroups and vulnerable groups. Thank you so much for your attention. This brings me to the end of our presentation. For more information, you can contact myself or my colleague Vivian.